Okay, this lecture is called Early Capitalism in the Gilded Age, in our course, the U.S. in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And I want to stress that the United States went from being, economically anyway, a developing nation in 1865 to become the world's top industrial power by 1900. Okay, so we're gonna explore this dramatic transformation, and I want to do a quick overview of early industrialization before 1865, right? And show how the key factors that contribute to America's industrial supremacy. Then look at the consider the emergence of the first big. Now let me talk about these big industries, starting with the railroads. Railroads first appeared in the United States during the 1820s, but these were primitive trains that covered only short distances. But in the 1830s and 1840s, railroad technology improved dramatically, both in the U.S. and in Britain and in some parts of Europe. Okay. Railroad networks expanded at a rapid pace. By 1865, some 35,000 miles of railroad track covered the United States. Now, these lines were often small, they were financially unstable, and limited to regional service. And that situation changed dramatically after the Civil War, when rail coverage expanded rapidly, growing to 193,000 miles of track by 1900. By then, the kind of mom-and-pop railroads had been gobbled up by a small number of big national railroads, such as the Pennsylvania Network and the New York Central. And because they offered fast and inexpensive transportation, the railroads played a key role in developing the national economy. Wherever they went, they opened up new areas for settlement. Farmers flocked to the new territories because railroads enabled them to sell their products on a national market. As we'll see in the next lecture about the West, that the idea of a Wild West is really myth, and the West, it turns out to have been built largely on industry. Shopkeepers, tradesmen, professionals, and others settled in the towns that had railroads and that developed near railroad junctions. The railroads themselves contribute to the national economy, right? Building the railroads required steel, required coal, and again required wood, a lot of wood. The large national railroads became America's first big businesses and pioneered many important business practices, such as incorporating and issuing stock. Right? Issuing stock allowed a corporation to raise capital to expand its business. Stockholders stood to benefit because if a company earned a profit, the price of the stock would rise. Corporate profits also benefited stockholders in the form of dividends. So the emergence of massive railroads forced owners, because they're so complicated, running railroads, forced owners to develop modern management practices such as standardization of parts and equipment and time zones. To manage the vast new commercial operations, railroad executives developed administrative structures as well as new systems of accounting, information management, and pricing. These practices became standard among many American corporations, from manufacturing to mining and retailing. We think of information management, for instance, as a 21st century thing, but it was a 19th century thing. Okay. Now, the steel industry. The importance of steel to the Industrial Revolution is really difficult to overstate. Steel transformed nearly every aspect of American life in the late 19th century, from industrial machinery to architecture, transportation, medicine, agriculture, and warfare. Like many of the great industries that emerged in this period, steel was intimately associated, at least initially, with one man, Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie entered the steel industry in 1870 when it was still kind of in its infancy. Over the next 20 years, his operations expanded dramatically as he built factories outfitted with the most advanced technology and bought out his competitors. Carnegie developed many important practices for running a successful corporation, including investing heavily in new technology, engaging in cutthroat competition, and watching costs to the point of obsession, right? Really watching the books, keeping an eye on production costs. Indeed, cost-cutting led Carnegie to become a pioneer of what's called vertical integration. That is, He not only built and bought steel mills, but he also acquired key enterprises tied to steel making, such as mines, smelting operations, railroads, and ships. Controlling these enterprises allowed him to lower his costs and guarantee steady delivery of crucial supplies. So you can say that the steel coming out of the Carnegie Steel Corporation factories were started with Carnegie coal, went all the way to went through Carnegie smelting, was sent to the factories on Carnegie railroads, produced in the Carnegie steel factory, and then shipped out on Carnegie railroads and in fact Carnegie ships. Okay. The next biggie is the oil industry. Now, like steel, the oil industry is, in this period anyway, is intimately associated with one man, John D. Rockefeller. Born in New York in 1839, Rockefeller moved to Cleveland as a teenager, and he seemed to have been a natural entrepreneur. In 1863, at the age of, wait for it, 24, Rockefeller opened his first oil refinery. Now, at the time, Cleveland was at the center of an emerging oil boom, and most of the nation's oil refining was located there. Note that the first oil boom was almost entirely focused on providing refined petroleum products for illumination, mainly kerosene lamps. And when Rockefeller looked at the small-scale refineries in Cleveland, he saw ineptitude, inefficiency, and waste. He also saw opportunity. In 1870, Rockefeller established the company he called Standard Oil and proceeded to buy out his competitors. By the early 1880s, he controlled more than 90% of the oil refining capacity in the nation. Now, like Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller pioneered certain fundamental business practices. For instance, he created the first trust, okay, which replaced the pool. The pool had been a secret collaboration of ostensibly rival companies in the same businesses that set prices and production limits so that all participants in the pool benefited. But the pools had no legal framework. There was no way to take legal action against a member who cheated within the pool, like cheating in a card game and getting away with it. Trusts, in contrast, were legally binding agreements that brought together many companies in the same industry under the direction of a board of trustees. To join a trust, a company relinquished a majority of its stock in the exchange for certificates that guaranteed it a share in the trust profits. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust grew to consist of 40 companies run by a single board, hand-selected by Rockefeller himself. Given the Rockefeller Trust's extraordinary profits, many businesses in other industries soon formed trusts as well. Now, I also said earlier, maybe the fourth industry, although we don't think of it kind of as an industry, is the art of selling. One key development in the creation of a consumer economy and a consumer society in the United States was the invention of the department store. Before the 1850s, consumers had to visit many stores, each of which specialized in only a few products. You went to the dressmaker, you went to the shoemaker, you went to the fruit stand, you went to the butcher, on and on and on. But in 1846, an Irish immigrant named Alexander Stewart established in New York what many consider to be the first department store. It was one huge building on Broadway, and he offered an incredible array of goods at fixed prices, no haggling. You went in and bought. Many people found this very not only interesting, but just made shopping a lot easier. So they copied this model and added to it. By the 1870s, department stores offered a wide array of products and promoted shopping as an, quote, experience, end quote. Okay. Now, I shouldn't say experience in quotes because that's not the term used at the time, but that's what we think of it as now. There's the shopping experience, the customer experience, crafting stores to make them more than just a place where you went in, handed over money, and got something. Consumers were drawn to lavishly decorated stores that featured such conveniences as restaurants, telegraph offices, and banks inside them. Not unlike today's Target, which is a store in its own right, but has ATMs in it, and has some of them have Starbucks in it. They don't have telegraph offices because we don't really have the telegraph anymore, but that sort of thing, a one-stop shopping. Okay. Other entrepreneurs develop retail venues that appeal to people's frugality and to everyday needs. Frank W. Woolworth opened his first five and dime store in Utica, New York in 1879. Okay. 30 years later, he owned 600 Woolworth stores across the country. Customers who didn't live in cities could shop by mail order from catalogs offered by Montgomery Ward and Sears, Roebuck and Company. Now, I often talk about, in American history classes, I'll talk about these catalogs and what a huge development they were for American consumers. These catalogs were essentially the Amazon of their day. If you look at a reproduction of the Sears catalog from the 1880s. I think the real famous one, the real extensive one, is 1893, but I could have that wrong. Anyway, you can Google it. You look through. It's like looking through an Amazon website. Okay, not nearly as deep in terms of the number of different products, but you could order everything from socks to a piano, right? Now, yet another dimension of corporate America's efforts to boost sales and consumption was to reach beyond U.S. borders. The country had long been an exporter of agricultural products, and its sales of manufactured goods to foreign buyers began to soar after the Civil War. By 1900, manufactured goods consisted of 1/3 of all U.S. exports. Okay, that's manufactured goods, not raw materials. In the late 19th century, businesses increasingly devoted time and resources to promote consumption. Advertising focused on appealing to the fears and desires of consumers. At the same time, advertisers promoted brand loyalty by devising catchy slogans and jingles and telling people that their soap had a certain thing that other soaps didn't have, and on and on and on. In 1867, American businesses spent $50 million on advertisements. By 1900, that figure had risen to $500 million. Now, I want to devote the second half of this lecture to something I call the self-made ideal. You see, one of the dominant ideas of America's Gilded Age was that of the self-made man, epitomized in the life of Andrew Carnegie. So I'm going to focus on Carnegie. Carnegie came to the United States as a penniless immigrant and began his working life as a bobbin boy in a textile mill. A bobbin boy is a boy, and it was almost always a boy because they were small, who went around replacing bobbins in machines. Okay, and you had to do it very quickly. You had to do it very constantly. But it's the type of thing. If you did it as a very young boy, you would see how big systems operated, right, and how they relied on this constant flow of material and constant work, right? Putting the bobbins in the machine. Okay. He then worked as a message boy and a telegraph operator. He went on to a position in the Pennsylvania Railroad and ultimately became the king of steel in the United States. Okay, so I want to define the self-made man in this part of the lecture and examine the sources of its popularity in the Gilded Age. And like Andrew Carnegie, in addition to Andrew Carnegie, I'm also going to look at some of the individuals who popularized the ideal and explore some of its more problematic aspects. Now, how do we define the ideal of the self-made man? The ideal of the self-made man celebrates a person who rises to success by virtue of his strong work ethic, sort of can-do attitude, willingness to sacrifice, and willingness to take risks. Often he lacks any special advantages, really, not necessarily genius, although Andrew Carnegie was a genius, and sometimes even faces formidable challenges. It seems to be that drive that there was a book that came out, I don't know, 5 years ago called Grit, and it was a huge bestseller because Everyone's looking for the one word answer to everything, and grit seems to be it, or seemed to be it. Anyway, historians don't like those sort of oversimplified answers, but it is true that often it's just that determination that makes the difference between a whole group of talented people and with basically the same skills and background, but whoever makes it to be a sort of Andrew Carnegie. This ideal had long roots in American history, going back to the beginning of the colonial period. Indeed, most of the people who came to colonial America in the 17th and 18th centuries were, by definition, aspiring self-made men and women. Okay? The majority came as indentured servants, hoping to eventually gain their freedom, gain land, and gain a chance for success. And enough of them succeeded to serve as an inspiration for others. We see, in the early period, the self-made man ideal in the life of Benjamin Franklin. Born in 1706 into an unexceptional family. As a teenager, he served an apprenticeship to his brother, who published a newspaper. But Franklin eventually ran away from his home in Philadelphia and found work in a printing shop. From there, he worked his way up, eventually owning his own successful printing and publishing business. Later, in his famous Poor Richard's Almanac, Franklin dispense hundreds of aphorisms relating to achieving success, such as "a penny saved is a penny earned," "early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise." More than a century later, Andrew Carnegie offered similar advice to aspiring young men. Although the ideal of the self-made man existed as far back as America's colonial past, it took on unprecedented popularity and influence in the Gilded Age. The ideal tapped into a fundamental element of the American character, and that was individualism. From the earliest days, like I said, of colonial America to the present, Americans cherished the notion of individualism, the idea that no matter who you are or where you began your life, you have the freedom and opportunity to chart your own destiny. Now, there's just as much myth as there is reality to that, but what tends to happen in the United States, and in other places too, is people overlook the myth part of that and believe in it wholeheartedly. The ideal's popularity during the Gilded Age can be attributed to the transformation of American society brought on by rapid industrialization and urbanization. These forces dramatically altered and expanded the ways in which one could achieve success and failure. It's one thing we don't always think about, failure, because most of these people actually fail, by obliterating some traditional trades and creating new ones. Okay, now how was this ideal popularized? The popularity of the self-made man ideal was also facilitated by an expansion in the availability of print literature. By far, the most successful and influential promoter of the ideal was Horatio Alger. Between 1866 and 1900, he published more than 100 short novels aimed at young boys, all with the same message. All that was needed to achieve success: hard work, honesty, thrift, ambition, and what he called pluck. Alger's most famous book was Ragged Dick, or Street Life in New York with the Boot Blacks. It first appeared in a serial in a magazine in 1867, and its popularity led Alger to publish it as a book the next year, in 1868, as a matter of fact. Ragged Dick tells the story of Richard Hunter, an orphan living on the streets of New York, who slowly learns the secrets of achieving respectability and success. All of Alger's protagonists begin life in terrible circumstances. They achieve success by working hard, by being honest, and by exhibiting heroic selflessness, often saving someone from drowning or returning a found bag of money to its rightful owner. So it's definitely this moral aspect to it. Initially, the characters may seem to be lucky, but Alger's real message is that one should always seek opportunity and be willing to take risks. Nowadays, we kind of call that making your own luck. Okay? Again, as much myth in there as there is reality, but that's what's important for our purposes here, is that people believe the whole thing. This is all the whole package, and believed it. The Alger-inspired genre was so popular in the Gilded Age that it prompted Mark Twain to pen a parody, Twain wrote a story called something called "The Story of a Bad Little Boy," and it's written in style of Horatio Alger. But at every turn, the usual uplifting scenarios fail to materialize for the protagonist, and things don't go for well for him. That, by the way, little boy was named James. Now, it was not only novelists writing books for younger boys who promoted the message of the self-made man. Some of the most famous people in the Gilded Age, including our friend Andrew Carnegie, told and retold their own life stories as tales of self-made men. Carnegie even developed a short talk, How to Succeed in Business, that he delivered hundreds of times to audiences of young men, almost overwhelmingly young men. Many of the self-help books today that we find on Amazon or wherever, it's by far the largest selling category of books in the world. So much so that the New York Times doesn't even list them on the bestseller list because it would just be a bestseller list of only self-help books. A lot of those have their origins in Carnegie's talks. His celebration of the self-made man was part of his larger campaign to celebrate the Industrial Revolution and to celebrate laissez-faire capitalism. He wrote lots of essays for popular magazines. He wrote several books. His most famous work, The Gospel of Wealth, was published in 1889. In it, Carnegie welcomes the widening wealth gap in America, saying, quote, "Much better this great irregularity than universal squalor," end quote. Carnegie also went out of his way to put a good face on industrial capitalism. Although many of his fellow tycoons denounced their critics in the press, Carnegie spoke only in positive terms about the virtues of industrialists, the nobility of labor, and their shared interests. In the 1890s, the Reverend Russell Conwell joined Carnegie in extolling the virtues of the new economy and the opportunities for self-made success. Conwell delivered a popular sermon titled Acres of Diamonds, in which he proclaimed that anyone who is intelligent, hardworking, and honest could become rich. The sermon was published as a pamphlet and sold more than 1 million copies. We see this now. We see this since the 80s in something called the prosperity gospel out there in American culture now. Preachers or various speakers go off and talk about how religion and economic prosperity are linked. Trading cards, believe it or not, what we would normally think of baseball cards or sports cards created by tobacco companies to boost sales, also lauded the self-made man. Okay? These cards were printed in series, and they were based on a number of themes, including obviously baseball players, American presidents, and military heroes. But the Duke Tobacco Company also produced a series titled Histories of Poor Boys Who Became Rich and Other Famous People. and so you had these little trading cards that featured people such as Carnegie, such as Cornelius Vanderbilt of railroad fame, such as Jay Gould of railroad and finance industry fame. The ideal of the self-made man was so compelling that even Americans born into wealth, those who couldn't present themselves as having lived rags to riches stories, found ways to portray themselves as self-made. The best example here is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, born into a wealthy Manhattan family and raised with the assistance of nannies and tutors, Roosevelt made certain that the public knew of his serious medical conditions, particularly asthma that he had suffered as a child. Lots of people would have sort of hidden or suppressed that or kept quiet about it. But by the way, his parents never thought he'd never live to childhood, but his father encouraged him to overcome his physical problems with exercise. Okay, so he built a gym in the family house and hired trainers. So in other words, as Roosevelt told the story, he vowed to remake his body, and he did so through weightlifting, running, gymnastics. Roosevelt claimed that this fitness regimen cured him of asthma, although, medically speaking, that's impossible. Nevertheless, Roosevelt's asthma symptoms were greatly diminished, and he went on to a public career in which he was famous for leading what he called the strenuous life. Okay, so rather than replacing the poverty to riches story, what Roosevelt did was took that. He couldn't claim he was born into poverty, but he could claim he was born into another type of weakness, and he, through his self determination and frankly his father's self determination, he built up what was known as his strenuous life. Okay. Even people who existed on the margins of society strove to present themselves as self-made men. Look at Booker T. Washington as an example, an important civil rights leader in the late 19th century. A key part of his public persona was the fact that he had been born a slave and had risen to become, in the parlance of the time, the leader of his race. When Booker T. Washington, wrote what became a best-selling autobiography in 1901, he titled it "Up from Slavery" and presented his life story as one of triumph over adversity. Now, don't get me wrong, we don't want to be completely triumphalist about it, because there were darker dimensions of the ideal. For the most part, the ideal was, as I've just sort of outlined, was presented in nothing but positive and optimistic terms. Anyone living in this great society can overcome adversity, whether it be poverty or bad health, and achieve success. But some Americans took the ideal to its furthest extreme, embracing a concept known as social Darwinism. You know, we saw a hint of this in a minute ago when I talked about Reverend Conwell's Acres of Diamonds sermon, in which he said, "There is not a poor person in the United States who was not made poor by his own shortcomings." And so when Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution by means of natural selection in 1859, he unwittingly provided some social theorists with the means to justify economic exploitation and inequality. Okay? These are social theorists, people who are trying to explain society sort of in scientific ways. British philosopher Herbert Spencer, who was a champion of Darwin and also became a champion of social Darwinism, argued that competition among humans led inexorably to the, quote, survival of the fittest, which is Spencer's phrase, not Darwin's phrase. That's very important to remember. Okay, now, although this surely was unfortunate for the unfit to wallow in poverty, it was the law of nature. Okay? You know, it's very unfortunate that if you're unfit, you have to wallow in poverty, but this is the law of nature. Spencer insisted, and it was very similar to the law of gravity. No amount of utopian theory, enlightened social policy, or Christian charity could alter this fact. Now, Spencer had a counterpart in the United States who was Yale sociologist William Graham Sumner, and he argued that, quote, millionaires may be fairly regarded as the naturally selected agents of society, while a, quote, drunkard in the gutter is just where he ought to be, end quote. Social Darwinism's hostility towards the poor was famously expressed in a widely reprinted sermon by Henry Ward Beecher, the nation's most renowned preacher and sort of minister. But he was extremely popular, and his sermons were read by nearly everyone. Dismissing the claims of workers that they could not live in dignity on wages of $1 a day, he asserted in 1877 that too many working men insist on smoking and drinking beer. A frugal working man could support his family on a diet of bread and water. Okay? Beecher said, literally bread and water. And the man who cannot live on bread and water is not fit to live. Now, if you ever tried to live on bread and water, you don't end up very healthy. And in fact, you don't end up fit to live. Okay, now, so what happens is that the people believe in the self-made ideal so strongly that they forget that, you know, a lot of this is up to chance and random luck and sort of what happens. Okay. Now, struggling workers and farmers in this period rejected social Darwinist claims that they were poor simply because they had, they were losers, in the phrase made popular by a recent politician. Instead, workers and farmers began to point accusing fingers at big business and Wall Street and the politicians that their wealth controlled. These people were sort of seen as like the pharaohs of old. No matter what you did, no matter how hard you worked, you were ultimately under the thumb of Pharaoh and or one of these pharaohs. And the only way to change that was to depose the pharaoh. And we'll be talking about that at various times in other parts of the course.